Hello, Steve White, Trick Boy 89, Steve White's 89. Yesterday was an interesting anniversary, which I kind of missed. Um, Enterprise, the final of Enterprise, these are the Voyages, aired May 13, 2005. So it's been 15 years since we've had a Star Trek series on TV. That was the end of 18 years of Star Trek shows running on TV from 1987 with Next Gen starting through to the end of Enterprise in 2005. They had overlapping shows. Next Gen overlapped with Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine overlapped with Voyager. Voyager ended as Enterprise started, and then Enterprise lasted for 4 years. Now, Enterprise. Now, okay. When Next Gen started, there was some um, controversy with fans because they wanted the original series back. They were going to do a series in the 70s that didn't happen. They did an animated series and they did the movies. And people wanted a TV series with the original characters. They couldn't really envision a show with other characters. So when the Next Gen was announced, because frankly they couldn't afford the original cast to have them do a TV series, they were going to leave them in the movies and create a new series and do it for syndication, not for the network, and blah blah blah. And some fans were not happy with that. But that didn't go past the show actually debuting. Once the show debuted and people understood that it was still Star Trek, that it was Gene's vision, and it gave them what they wanted, it gave them Star Trek, they let go of having to have the original cast and embrace the new characters. It took a little while, but really, basically, as soon as the show started airing and people saw it, wasn't any sort of I don't know. It just worked. People understood it was still Star Trek, even though they had a different cast, and it was set 80 years in the future from the films and 100 years from the original series. It worked. People loved it. People just waited for it every week. I mean, it was a huge hit, syndication, and it was the first drama done in syndication like that, first run syndication. So it sort of changed the TV landscape for a while as well. It led to other shows like Xena and stuff like that. And there's at the moment there's a lot of revisionist history where fans hated Next Gen, they hated all the series. Every series had some people sort of, a small amount of people standing back and going, just wait, this is not, how I think it should be, or I'm afraid of this is going to be different or something. And there's always that. But once each show started, people saw there's nothing to be afraid of. It was still Star Trek. It was good. Now, Deep Space Nine had some issues as they went into using themes of war and stuff, which I didn't really get as a kid. But now as an adult, I have problems with them, and I don't like Deep Space Nine. I kind of consider it was where Star Trek started to um, be what would you call it? Well, changed. I can't think of the right term. And I mean, Voyager, people saw it as very much a return to form because part of the reason why Deep Space Nine got away with being so different was because it had Next Gen. So if you didn't like Deep Space Nine, you could watch Next Gen. And same thing when Voyager started. Well, you could watch Voyager because Voyager was just like Next Gen except Lost in Space. Um, so this whole idea now that everyone hated the series and all that is a myth. It's sort of fake news in a way. Now, Enterprise was a bit different because Enterprise was different from the other series. It was a prequel. It didn't originally use the title Star Trek. It was just called Enterprise, um, and that was the first thing that scared people and sort of set people off. And there was some resistance to the series when it first started. And I remember that. I was there at the time. I remember what fans were saying. I remember reading the articles and seeing stuff online and stuff. Um, but again, once it started, people saw it was still Star Trek. It may have been set in a different time frame again, um, and it may have had some issues because there were things we wanted to see in Star Trek that we couldn't because they sort of hadn't been invented yet. And the point of the series was to show those things come into being and evolve and that. So that kind of sucked a little bit. And the uniforms, it looked like NASA uniforms, stuff like that. People didn't like it, but the spirit of the show was there and it was so much stronger than Voyager and Next Gen, because Voyager and Next Gen, they're very comfortable. They were very complacent in space. You know, they were just cruising around space. It wasn't like the original series where they're on the edge of the frontier, and this was them going into the frontier. They were the first people, and that I loved that element of the show. Now, the way the show ran was kind of different for me because I came into Star Trek. They were all sort of there. They're already on video, on TV, late in the season, and Enterprise was the first show I really sort of had to sit and wait for it to come. And part of that was because they released the first season on video. Because there was a huge thing in the 90s where people would just watch the show on video, because watching it on TV in Australia especially was a bitch. It would be on at night. It would constantly be shuffled around between 10, 11, 12 at night. It was always hard. And it was cruel because the networks knew the Star Trek fans would wait and look for it. So that's why they put it there. It was always rated well, always did well, because they knew the fans were loyal and they could basically shuffle it around and the fans would come and look for it. But a lot of people just waited and got it on video. Basically, I think once a month they released the video, and everyone would either buy it or they'd run out to the video stores and rent it. And so many people, their Friday nights were renting Star Trek. And it was a good time to be a Star Trek fan. There was so much Star Trek. But Enterprise, they did the first season, and whether Enterprise didn't sell well or whether just videos in general didn't sell well, they didn't do the second season. And it was gone, and you just had to wait for it to air on TV. And I had to sit and waiting for the show to come on. What time is it going to come on this week? Is it going to be on this week? It was hell, but it did make you appreciate it more, and every episode sort of was a bit more special because you sort of had to sit and wait for it. You had to earn it instead of just sort of getting it as a season or as a couple episodes in a row, or sort of choosing, oh, I'll rent it this week, I'll watch it tonight. It was sort of different. Now, before the end of the series finished on TV, and I don't know when it finished on TV, I had moved. I'm trying to remember where I lived and what year it was. But basically, the DVDs for season 4, the DVDs for the whole 4 seasons, had been released, and season 4 came out before the final episode aired on TV. So when the final episode aired on TV, it was well after the actual final, and I had watched the whole series on DVD. But I watched the final episode on TV so I didn't really watch the full season on TV. I watched the second and third, but I did watch the last episode just because it was the last episode, and I wanted to watch the last episode on TV. Now, with the final, I liked the final. I understood the intention of the final was to say goodbye to the whole series, the whole 18 years of that Next Gen era on TV. And I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a way of, because a lot of people sort of argued that due to First Contact, there was an alternate timeline, and Enterprise was part of that alternate timeline that was created when the Borg went back in time, blah, blah, blah. And that's why there were differences and little things that didn't quite fit canon, because there were some mistakes with Enterprise where they tried to adhere to the canon and respect it, but they slipped up a few times and things didn't quite make sense. Unlike some other shows that deliberately tried to destroy canon, go against it. Enterprise tried, they failed a few times, but for the most part they succeeded. And you could watch it and you knew it was part of the same universe and it was fine. Unlike some other shows, which we not mention here. But the final episode came, and a lot of people didn't like it. Now, like I said, I got what they were saying, what they were trying to do, and by making it a holodeck recreation, they were sort of putting them in the same universe. We had the Next Gen crew aware of this crew, so it made sure that to say this is all the same universe, it's all canon, it all works, and for the most part it did. And that was successful, and that was the beautiful thing about Star Trek. It was an 18-year run of the same universe, the same characters, and you got to watch it and enjoy it and really believe in it and just immerse yourself in it with all the material and books and all the other secondary canon and fan stuff. It was a great time to be a science fiction fan and be a Star Trek fan. The original series was in the 60s, it repeated in the 70s, into the 80s, and then Next Gen kind of took over, and people were more focused on the movies. But the original never went away; it still did well, but the focus was really on the next gen for the 90s, and Star Wars was having a nice long sleep, and it was a really good era. But a lot of people had problems with the final. Now, I met most of the cast from Enterprise in the last couple of years of the production, and I met Jolene Blaylock just after they'd filmed the final, and she hated it. She was angry, and I didn't share her view, and it was so difficult because I hung out for a bit, and I just couldn't mention it. I wanted to talk to her about it and try and explain to her why it worked for me and why it worked for fans, and I think what they were trying to do. But I wasn't going to touch that. And some of the other actors felt the same way, and I understood. It was their show. They felt like their show was usurped, and they used their show to do a final for the whole of Star Trek. I'm like, yeah, but it was the whole of Star Trek. It wasn't just your show. It was the Star Trek universe, the whole thing. So I got what they were trying to do, and I don't agree with a lot of the criticism of Enterprise. Now, Enterprise rated well. Like, why was it cancelled? It was mostly politics. Um, Basically, CB, the split between Paramount and Viacom, they gave the CW to CBS. Now, Paramount was basically charging UPN to make Enterprise. They were charging him $1.7 million for the license. They had to cut that back to 800,000 or something, and change to digital TV and make a lot of concessions and drop a couple of episodes from the episode count to get a fourth season, so they could safely go into syndication with Enterprise. And they managed to get that concession because they obviously knew the split was coming. The split was announced in June, the month after Enterprise ended, and then it happened in December. So there could have been no fifth season because Paramount couldn't make it because they didn't have the Star Trek license anymore. They couldn't do Star Trek on TV anymore, and CBS didn't want to do it because even though the show rated well on UPN was being canned, and they had other shows that did well on UPN that were far less expensive, and they don't care about content. They just if they had a reality show that had rate as well, they just make that instead, which is what they did. We won't mention what they replaced Enterprise with. I think if you know, you try and forget it, and if you don't know, you don't need to be traumatized. But yeah. So people protested. I remember there were campaigns. They raised $3.8 million, I think, to try and they were trying to raise $32 million to fund a fifth season of the series. And a lot of people took it really serious. There were a lot of campaigns. There were protests out the front. I signed some stuff. But it wasn't successful because ultimately they couldn't make the show anymore. They weren't going to make the show anymore. The people who are in charge now weren't the ones who started making Star Trek. They kept making it because it made money. But once that split happened and the rights and merchandise issues and all that crap happened, there was no point. That wasn't going to happen. Now, at the time, we didn't really understand this. It took later for fans to actually understand the politics and what happened. At the time, it was just blamed on low ratings, which is a bit unfair. They moved the show to the deaf slot Friday evening at like 9 p.m., which is what they did with Star Trek, the original series back in the 60s. They did the same thing. They moved it. They promised Gene a good slot, and then they put him in the deaf slot, and he walked. And that was the end of that show. And we'll talk about the ratings of the original series sometime, in the mythology around that not rating well when it really did. Enterprise, it did as well as its competitor, which was Stargate. They both got 3 or 4 million each. I think the highest for Enterprise that year was 3.8 million viewers, and the highest for Stargate I think was 3.2 million that year. In its, I think it's season 8 was the same. I always thought it did better than Smallville, but Smallville did between 4 and 5 million. Star Trek got between 2 and 3 million, I think, was the average. I had to look at the ratings and I couldn't find an average, and I didn't have the time to work it out. But Smallville was a network show. Enterprise was a network show as well, but the UPN didn't have the same sort of viewership as other shows, so it was more comparable to a network. I mean, a cable show like Stargate, which got about the same number of viewers, which makes sense because it had basically the same fan base. Everyone who watched that watched Enterprise as well. So it didn't deserve to be cut. It was doing well. The fourth season they brought on Manikoto, and it was really getting good. And it's a pity that it was cut, and we miss it. I miss it. I grew up my whole life. I had Star Trek, and then I didn't have Star Trek anymore. So I was really hungry when the films came up. I was okay with them because they weren't sci-fi, they weren't Star Trek, but they were a different universe, and they were action films. So, and they seemed to lead a lot of people who wouldn't have watched Star Trek into Star Trek, who then watched the series. So I was okay with it being a gateway thing. But then what happened, which we won't talk about, because this is a happy video of remembering a good time and it's ending. But I'm going to go. I'm done. I really just wanted to commemorate the ending of Star Trek, the last episode. And I'm going to go back and watch it because I really enjoyed the series.